And good morning to everyone, or
Yeah,
good
we see.
afternoon, wherever you may be. So I am a cancer rehabilitation physician by training, but over time, as I was kind of working through physical rehabilitation problems and challenges, it became more and more clear to me that if we don't address the needs of the whole person and thinking about spiritual, existential concerns and issues related to resiliency, at least in my view, we weren't addressing rehabilitation in the most comprehensive form. I'm fortunate to have now my partner and colleague, Dr. Philip Chang, who's going to be talking more about the exercise and rehabilitation ideals in a few moments. But if I may, I'd like to um, take a maybe perhaps less traditional approach and think about things on a more holistic level. And I know we've been exposed to and learning a lot of medical information, but I'd like to invite you to just take a step back and think more broadly about some of these really, I would argue, basic fundamental questions about all of our lives. And these are the following. What does it mean to be healthy? What does it mean to be whole? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean to be truly resilient? A lot of the ideas I'm about to share were really taken from a 6 week, 12-hour program. I'm going to try to distill some of the high level themes in just about 15 or 20 minutes. And I would just want to add as we're starting, if somebody was just recently diagnosed and really in the thick and middle of it, I would empathize and say that these are really hard things to contend with when we're just starting this journey, and so these might be ideas that we might want to revisit when perhaps it's a more viable time to kind of process some of these existential concerns. So, how does one cultivate resiliency? I would argue that one essential theme are those of thinking about the role of having a sense of meaning and purpose and what this may have to do with resiliency. And I like to start this story with an anecdote, and I want to emphasize this is just an anecdote. But it's an interesting one in my mind. This is the story of Mr. Israel Crystal, who in 2016 got a fair amount of news media because he became the oldest male alive in the world at 112. He got the Guinness book record of that time. He actually passed away 1 year later at 113. And what drove a lot of people to his story was not just the fact that he made it to 112, which is incredible for anyone, but he was a Holocaust survivor and still made it to this incredible age. And so it was known that he had whittled down to something like 87 pounds. You know, his wife and his family had all died and perished. He lost all of his belongings. He truly suffered in a way that I don't think anybody would argue, but he still somehow made it to this age. And so everyone was asking him, how did you make it to 112 after going through all this? And I'm just pulling out one passage from one interview that at least resonated with me. And this is what he said. I don't know the secret for long life. I believe that everything is determined from above, and we shall never know the reasons why. There have been smarter, stronger, and better looking men than me who are no longer alive. All that is left for us to do is to keep on working as hard as we can and rebuild what is lost. So I'll be the first to admit I have no idea how he made it to 112 and 113, and I'm sure luck and maybe genetic factors and other things that we'll never know played a role. But I'd like to think that at least that last sentence in this quote may have contributed, and that's this idea that it seems at least that he had some clear sense of a reason for living, a mission and a purpose in his life. And maybe that may have contributed. Again, it's impossible to know. And this is really what Dr. Viktor Frankl talked about 75 years later in his seminal work, Man's Search for Meaning. So if you're not familiar with him, I imagine many of you are. I would highly recommend his work. It's not long; it's about 130 pages or so, but it's incredibly profound. A little bit of background about him: he was a young psychiatrist when he was kind of absorbed into the concentration camps. He was actually in 4 different concentration camps, including Auschwitz. And similar to Mr. Crystal, he lost virtually everyone. His mother, father, brother, and pregnant wife all perished. He, and again, endured starvation, infectious illnesses, incredibly hard labor environments, and on and on and on. I'm not here to retell that story, but I think what gives his work a tremendous amount of credibility is that he suffered. I mean, there's no denying that he suffered. And what he basically argued were a few points. Number one, his observation was that maybe, let's say, 1 in 10 people survived the camps, so not many. But what he observed is that that 1 in 10 seemed to have something in common. And what he believed and observed and wrote about was that that 1 in 10, again, all seemed to have a reason for which they needed to survive. They need to get back to their science, to their teaching, to their art, to their family member. They need to tell this story so that hopefully this will never happen again. Whatever it was for that individual, his observation was that people needed a meaning, a hope to live for. Um, and he often kind of referred to the works of Nietzsche, with the idea that if one has a strong enough why, they can overcome anyhow. And this was really the basis of man's search for meaning. And Frankl argued that there are 3 basic sources where one can obtain a sense of meaning and purpose, and any part of this triangle could work, or a combination thereof, either through our work. And I appreciate the comments previously. This could be in volunteering, in service, in being of doing something of contribution to others, in acts of love, or caring for another person. And I think an idea that is relevant for, I think, all of us right now is really cultivating a sense of courage, particularly during difficult times. I mean, I think we could all agree that courage can't exist if there weren't moments of fear or distress. It's only when we're going through difficult times where we can cultivate a sense of courage. So he would argue that any of these 3 ideas would be viable sources to find meaning and purpose. And he said, again, coming back to this idea of personal responsibility, that he would say, when we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves. Again, coming back over and over again to this idea that nobody can take away certain freedoms from us. And again, he wrote this book in the 40s and the 50s, a long time ago, about 75 years ago. And again, we could imagine how he would feel if he would see some more recent research studies, and this is from a very reputable journal, Psychosomatic Medicine, where they kind of grouped together over 130,000 individuals. And basically, they were able to look at who had diabetes and high blood pressure, and who was a smoker, and who was obese, and all the things that we typically think of with how long one lives in terms of predicting mortality. And when you factor that all in, when you compared those individuals that had the strongest sense of purpose in their lives compared to those that had the least, again, what you see is that all-cause mortality was reduced by 17%, and cardiovascular events, in other words, heart attacks and strokes, also reduced by 17%. So again, I think meaning and purpose is one basic critical theme. The other idea that Frankl and others have talked a lot about is learning, and I know that this is not easy, but learning to master a sense of perspective in a way that's authentic and not just being a Pollyanna. And again, Frankl was not the first person to talk about this. The Buddha, of course, from centuries ago, wrote, "Your worst enemy cannot harm you as much as your own thoughts unguarded. But once mastered, no one can help you as much, not even your father or your mother." again, alluding to this idea of the types of thoughts that we have is as important as anything external. And Sean Aker, most recently from Harvard, said that only 10% of your long-term happiness is based on your external world, while 90% is based on how your brain processes the world. Again, echoing this idea that how we perceive things, and again, it doesn't mean being insincere or putting, so-called rose-colored glasses, but how we're able to manage and perceive our situation, our circumstances in a way that empowers us is probably going to be as important as anything. And again, Frankl wrote about this very deeply, and this is a passage that I think is so incredibly profound. He said, "We who lived in concentration camps can remember the men who walked through the huts comforting others, giving away their last piece of bread. They may have been few in number, but they offer sufficient proof that everything can be taken from a man but one thing, the last of the human freedoms, to choose one's attitude in any given set of circumstances, to choose one's own way." Again, none of these ideas I empathize are easy, but I think people like Frankl and Mr. Israel Crystal and others remind us that it at least is possible, even if it's not easy. And this really, in a sense, underlies the power of cognitive behavioral therapy that has gained a lot of attention through more recent studies, which is how we respond to situations that we're given. And there's this quote that I think captures Frankl's ideas and really the secret of cognitive behavioral therapy, which is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and our freedom. So there's a kind of an analogous idea to what Frankl and others have talked about. And I think this is really well illustrated in the study I'm about to describe. But before describing the study, we have to define a couple of basic terms, because the study looked at two groups of individuals. Half of them were basically on the hedonistic spectrum of the personality world, which means basically, as you all know, a hedonist is someone, right, who is drawn to pleasures. They're drawn to pleasurable things in life. So hypothetically, if I was at a cocktail party, hopefully we'll get there again one day soon, and if I told you the person sitting to my left was a very kind of hedonistic type personality, I might assume that they're there because they knew that there was going to be filet mignon served. They knew there would be nice wine and music and people were dressed up, and they were drawn to these facets of that dinner. Now, on the other hand, if I told you the person sitting to my right was a more eudaimonic personality, what does that mean? And then this is a term that originated from Aristotle, basically referring to a more virtuous lifestyle. So these are people who are more interested in volunteering and being of service, in pursuing meaningful conversations. So this person on my right might be there because they wanted to reconnect with an old friend that they hadn't seen and have a meaningful conversation, or because they were fundraising for a cause that was important to them, or something along those lines. Now, again, the study that I'm about to describe, they looked at people who were at the ends of this bell curve, right? You're either very strongly hedonistic or very strongly eudaimonic. All of them reported high levels of well-being. So when they filled out these questionnaires, they all reported to be happy. But what they decided to do, and I'll walk you through this because I know it's a little bit busy, is they wanted to look at their inner biology. They looked at their blood. And I'll walk you through this. And I'm really going to focus on, for the sake of time, just part B of this figure. And what they noticed is that the hedonistic group, they had higher levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines. And as I'm sure you may be aware, these cytokines, when they're kind of chronically released, they're associated with heart disease and diabetes and perhaps dementia and perhaps some cancers, like breast cancer and colon cancer, perhaps others. and they had lower levels of antibodies, right? Which is critical for how our immune system is functioning. And on the other hand, the eudaimonic group basically was in reverse, right? They had lower levels of pro-inflammatory cytokines, and you could see they had much higher levels of antibodies. And again, we have to wonder, as we'll talk about in a moment, what Frankl would have thought, because one of the passages from Frankl's work that I think was so incredibly moving was he beckons his readers to stop asking yourself, what do I expect from life? He kind of assumed that that was kind of a pathway to being doomed when things don't go well in life. When everything's peachy, it's probably okay for a while to go around asking, what do I expect from life? But he again urged his readers to instead say, what does life expect from me? And I realize there's just a small transposition of words, but the implications in terms of how one lives really couldn't be more different. And you can think about it for a moment in terms of going about life thinking, what do I expect, and what kind of attitude and outlook we have versus what does life expect. And again, as you can imagine, some may choose to substitute the word God or creator or the universe or nature, or however you want to use that. But I think it gets to this same idea, coming back to what Frankl argued for over and over again, which is this sense of personal responsibility of what we have to do to manage as best we can with the circumstances that we're given. And again, Frankl wrote this 75 years ago, but we could argue that the hedonistic pattern that we talked about is fairly analogous to, what do I expect from life? And the eudaimonic spectrum analogous to what does life expect from me? What can I do to give back, to contribute, to make a difference? And again, remember, if I go back to this slide for a moment, you remember Frankl argued that it wasn't necessarily the biggest people that survived, but those that had a sense of meaning and purpose. And he argued that somehow they didn't succumb as easily to the infectious outbreaks, for example. And again, this is just a guess, a wild guess on my part. But if we believe this idea that the eudaimonic people have higher levels of antibodies, that means they have stronger immune systems. Maybe Frankl was on to something that actually makes some biological sense. Again, these ideas I know are not easy, and these are like profound shifts from many of us, myself including, as I learn to immerse myself in some of these works. But practice can, modify our perspectives and our resiliency over time. And I love this quote from Wilfred Peterson that really, I think, speaks to this idea. This is what he said: as a single footstep will not make a path on the earth, so a single thought will not make a pathway in the mind. To make a deep physical path, we must walk and walk again. To make a deep mental path, we must think again and again the kind of thoughts we wish to have dominate our lives. Okay, and I just want to shift gears to one of the themes that we spend a lot more time in the program, which is that of learning to cultivate gratitude. We know, and I'm going to go through this very quickly from the science, that gratitude allows us to be present. So we talk about mindfulness a lot, but it's another way to access the mindfulness space. And if you think about it, when you're experiencing gratitude, it's really hard to be bitter or resentful or angry or envious. It seems that people who are grateful more regularly sleep better, they have stronger immune systems, they're more likely to empathize, they are more likely to connect socially with others. And I'm talking about it here because it turns out that people who are grateful more regularly seem to be more resilient to stress and distress. Now, if you were like me, I always assumed that when everything in life kind of lines up perfectly, when you got the perfect test score and the perfect job and the perfect school that you got into, or things kind of turn out perfectly, then you'll be grateful. but it's become unequivocally clear that it's not about thinking that life is perfect, because if we wait for life to be perfect, there are going to be very few moments of gratitude. And there are many that would argue that it's the reverse, including someone else that I've learned tremendously from, Brother David Steindl-Rast, who's a Benedictine monk. He's really made it his life work to talk about the value of authentic gratitude and living gratefully, in a way, again, that's authentic. And he often says that um, we can't be grateful for example, for war or famine or things that are terrible. And this is what he says. He says, in every given moment, we can be grateful, even though we cannot be grateful for every given moment. When we are confronted by something terribly difficult, we can rise to the occasion and respond to the opportunity given to us. And he goes on to talk about this idea that when something difficult happens to us, perhaps the thing we can be grateful for is how we can learn from that opportunity or help others as a result of that experience, or grow in some way. And his other argument was that most of the time we can be grateful for things that give us some kind of pleasure, but that we're just rushing through our day-to-day circumstances in a way that blinds us to these little moments. And if you have the time, there's a really wonderful 12-minute TED talk that he gives that unfortunately I don't have the time to share. It's really worth the 10, 11, 12 minutes. If you can just go onto YouTube and check that out. He really speaks about this in a really amazingly articulate way. In the last minute or two, I just want to talk about connectivity. And if I were to ask all of you this question, what human condition increases the risk of death as much as smoking cigarettes and more than physical inactivity or obesity? And if I didn't kind of prime you to the answer with the previous slide, most people would often say, you know, it must be depression or stress. The answer is actually chronic loneliness. And we know that being chronically isolated or lonely is equivalent to smoking about 15 cigarettes a day. And believe me, I realize me talking about this, you know, in the midst of a pandemic, the irony is not lost upon me, but it still doesn't, in my mind, mitigate the importance of trying to stay connected in a way that is appropriate and makes sense in your own individual circumstances, and even using technology to the degree that it makes sense. We know that chronic loneliness changes how our cardiovascular immune system works. It's associated with 26% higher mortality rates in the general population. Unfortunately, I'm not aware of any studies done in sarcoma specifically, but for breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and others, there have been some evidence that while it may not cause the cancer, it's associated with a higher rate of progression from the cancer. And so I think the critical point to convey in terms of thinking about how we can be resilient in this context is that loneliness is subjective. And we all know people who are married and may feel incredibly lonely. And we all know people who live alone and don't feel lonely at all. Because again, it's going back to that earlier quote about how we perceive our relationships and the people around us. And it may be just an uncle across town or a cousin that we're close to or a friend across the country or someone that we can connect to is all it takes to keep us from experiencing the subjective experience of loneliness. And I just want to emphasize that if that for some, just being aware that, you know what, there's this idea of social connectivity that seems to be really important for my physical health and my mental health, that just the awareness may be enough to invest some time in staying connected, in working through, right? I realize, you know, let's be honest, it's a kind of, we have a divided, you know, nation right now, and it takes effort and energy and investment and time to try to stay connected with the more meaningful relationships. The point of these couple of slides on my behalf is to highlight the idea that it's important to stay connected for very real reasons that hopefully I'll have a chance to talk about in another venue. For those of us that are stuck and can't, seem to connect, again, cognitive behavioral therapy has been proven to be effective in this setting, in that it teaches us in how to reinterpret the people that really may be there around us, and think about this in a more adaptive direction. And I love this quote by this researcher at Chicago who really did a lot of the loneliness biological research. He said, "The degree of social connection that can improve our health and happiness is both as simple and as difficult as being open and available to others." And again, he was basically highlighting this idea that there's this thing that can reduce your risk of heart disease and maybe dementia and depression, and maybe reduce recurrence risk for certain cancers, and on and on and on. And it seems, and it's not even a medicine, it seems incredible to have this. But it's hard, right? It's hard because for all the reasons we talked about, that relationships take work, and I hope we're making the case that it's worth the effort. So in closing, some ideas to think about are meaning-centered living as one tool, learning the art of mastering perspective, trying to live with a sense of gratitude without being a Pollyanna about things, staying connected in a way that, again, is safe for you and is reasonable for your circumstances, trying to be mindful in a way that makes sense. Again, I didn't talk about this today, but trying to keep a sense of humor in the middle of everything is probably as important as anything. Thank you all so much for your attention, for the opportunity to be with you. And I guess, Charles, do I have a minute or two for questions, if there are any?
You do have a couple minutes for questions. And thank you so much as well. I always enjoy your presentation. Really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yes, excellent thought-forming talk. I'll just go straight into the questions. This one, I think Anna B had one from before, so I'll answer that on a later time. So I feel this approach is well-intentioned, but it seems like blaming those who died in the camps for their own deaths. Theodore Adorno said, we are all part of an action of our own making. Recognition of this is important for resilience, ?
I appreciate the question. And if I may take that, and again, and this highlights what I said earlier, like we go through this in 12 weeks, or excuse me, 6 weeks, 12 hours. And I was just giving you a couple of snippets. Frankl, and we talk about this in our full program, spent a lot of time talking about this idea that there were many people that had a tremendous sense of meaning and purpose and still died, right? And there were people that had none and somehow still survived. So there were certainly exceptions to all of these ends of the spectrum. But his concern wasn't why people died, but how some people survived. And even though it wasn't a perfect math, right? I mean, if you saw that study about the Eudaimonic people, their antibody level was increased by 20, 30%, but it didn't mean you had a perfect immune system to every insult that is viable. So all of these ideas are, in my mind, tools that we can engage in a way that makes sense, not that it keeps tragedy from happening. And Frankl, I appreciate the question, actually did spend a concerted amount of effort really trying to clarify that point.
Okay, so, and then how does non-pathological introversion fit into this?
Great point. So an introvert, so this brings up the idea of having like a personal thermostat, right? There are people who are just wired that they need, 6, 10, 15 close contacts to avoid the feeling of loneliness. And there are, again, people that may live alone and or need at least time alone, which is how I view someone as an introvert who feels recharged when they get some time on their own or with some very close contacts. I think it highlights what the question is asking, which is ultimately it's our perspective, right? It's how we it's how we perceive what we need and try to fulfill where our thermostat is set. So I appreciate that point as well.
And then it looks like Jennifer may have a question, but I don't know if she just has her hand up in error. But I just wanted to ask, can you be both hedonistic and a eudaimonic?
I think I am. I think most of us are. Again, remember, it's the bell curve, right? Where most of us have some hedonistic traits, some eudaimonic traits. But like all things, there are people, and you probably can think of a few that are very strongly hedonistic and very strongly eudaimonic. And what was interesting about that study is they were able to pull from those ends, but all of them were happy on the surface, at least. And again, it's not to say that if we're on one end or the other, if that's working for us. But I think that my bias now is that the hedonistic spectrum works when life is going just peachy fine. And then we need some other strategies when we're encountering some challenges. And I'd love to talk about this more in the future, but I don't want to take away from Dr. Chang. And again, thank you all so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was just really interesting, especially about the loneliness. And, and that's one of the main purposes of the Sarcoma Alliance. And here
absolutely,
in this exchange, so people don't feel that they're alone.
Absolutely.
And, there's others out there that are experiencing similar things in you, and in order to connect with them. So we provide that opportunity. So really, very, very enlightening, and thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Thanks again, Dr. Asher. Always great to hear from you. And one of these years, we're going to meet in person. So